A forgotten 17-year-old dog faced his final winter alone, until a stranger came and changed everything. He was 17, forgotten, curled up in a corner of a cold shelter, waiting for the end. No tail wags, no visitors, just silence. But then, a widow walked in, carrying nothing but a homemade blanket, and a heartbreak of her own. Why did her eyes lock onto his? And what secret did this golden old soul carry beneath his brittle fur? What happened next will restore your faith, not just in dogs, but in people. Stay with us, because this story is not about endings, it's about one final beginning. Winter had settled early over Willow Creek, Colorado. The air was sharp with frost, and a silvery veil of snow clung stubbornly to rooftops and pine branches. The town, nestled in a valley between mountains, carried a hush to it in the mornings, as if the world was holding its breath. Just beyond the town limits, past a winding road lined with leafless aspens, stood the Willow Creek Animal Shelter. Modest in size and older than most, it had peeling green paint, chain-link fencing that whistled when the wind blew, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Every heart matters." Inside kennel number 12, an old golden retriever named Finn lay curled up tightly on a faded blue blanket. His fur, once golden like sunrise, was now dull and matted with age. His snout had turned white, and his eyes, clouded by time, stared at nothing in particular. At 17, Finn had the posture of resignation. His body trembled occasionally from arthritis. His hearing was poor, and his appetite minimal. He hadn't barked in weeks. Once a therapy dog in a veterans hospital, Finn had spent years comforting others, until funding was cut, and he was retired, which in his case meant left behind. No ceremony, no farewell, just abandonment. Visitors walked by his kennel every day. Some gasped at the puppies tumbling over each other next door. Others paused at the younger dogs barking with excitement. But no one paused at Kennel 12. Not anymore. Until that morning. Margaret Clark, known to most as Maggie, stepped through the shelter's front door, clutching a canvas tote bag filled with handmade quilts. She was 68, with short silver hair and a lean, almost bird-like frame. Her shoulders stooped slightly, not from age but from the quiet weight of grief. She wore a dark green parka several years old, boots that had seen better days, and gloves with one missing finger. A former nurse, Maggie had spent most of her life caring for others, first her patients, then her husband, and briefly, her son before he moved away. After her husband Harold died of a sudden heart attack 2 years ago, Maggie's world grew silent. The kind of silence that didn't come from lack of sound, but from the absence of laughter, footsteps, and shared coffee in the morning. Maggie volunteered in her own quiet way. She made blankets for shelter animals and delivered them once a month. She never stayed long, just a quick handoff and a polite smile. But today, something pulled her deeper into the rows of kennels. Perhaps it was the cold in her bones, or the emptiness of her home echoing too loudly. Or perhaps it was something else. The shelter's manager, Lydia, a warm-faced woman in her 40s with curly auburn hair and a no-nonsense air, greeted her. "Morning, Miss Maggie. Back with more love stitched into fabric, I see." Maggie nodded, offering a small smile. "Thought the little ones could use something warm. It's going to be a bitter week." Lydia led her toward the back. Dogs barked, whined, pawed at the gates. Some spun in excited circles. But Maggie's eyes drifted toward the last kennel on the left, where silence hovered like a fog. "Who's that?" she asked, stopping. Lydia followed her gaze. "Ah, that's Finn. He's been with us nearly 6 months now." Maggie stepped closer. Finn didn't lift his head. His breath came in slow, shallow rhythms. A faint tremble ran through his hind legs. "He looks so tired," Maggie murmured. "He is," Lydia said softly. "He's 17. He came from a veterans hospital, was a therapy dog for years. But after they cut their program, no one came for him. He just ended up here." 17, Maggie whispered. "That's a lifetime." Lydia nodded. "He hardly eats, doesn't respond much. We're doing what we can, but, well, most people aren't looking to adopt a dog that old." Maggie didn't reply. She knelt slowly, her knees cracking slightly as she lowered herself to Finn's level. The dog stirred just barely, one ear twitching, but his eyes remained distant. "I brought this," she said, pulling out one of her quilts. It was soft flannel, stitched in a patchwork of deep blues and grays. She pushed it gently through the bars. "It's not much, but maybe it'll help." As she rose, something unexpected happened. Finn's paw moved. Not much, just the faintest motion, the kind that could have been dismissed as reflex. But Maggie saw it. She blinked. Then slowly Finn's eyes lifted and met hers for a single moment. They were clouded, but there was something behind them. Not hope, not yet, but something like curiosity or memory. Maggie pressed a hand to her chest. The look shook something loose inside her, something she hadn't felt in years, a stirring. She turned to Lydia. "Do many people ask about him?" Lydia hesitated. "Not really. A few folks glance in, but once they hear his age, they move on." Maggie's fingers curled around the strap of her bag. "That's a shame," she murmured. "He was someone's comfort once." "Yes, ma'am," Lydia said gently. "But people tend to want new starts, not endings." Maggie didn't answer. She gave Finn one last look before walking back through the shelter. Outside, snow had begun to fall. Light flurries drifted across her coat as she reached her car. She sat in the driver's seat, hands resting on the wheel, eyes distant. That night, Maggie couldn't sleep. She stared at the photo above her fireplace, a sepia-toned image of her and Harold on their wedding day. He had been taller than her, with laugh lines deep from years of jokes and shared stories. He had always loved dogs. Their first golden retriever, Sonny, had passed in his arms the year before Harold did. In the silence, Maggie whispered, "You would have liked him, Harold. That old boy. He reminded me of Sonny. Of you." Outside, the snow thickened. The town lay under a hush of white, and somewhere, in Kennel 12, Finn stirred in his sleep. For the first time in months, he dreamed. The next morning in Willow Creek broke slowly. The snow had thickened overnight, blanketing the streets and rooftops in a soft hush. Maggie Clark woke before dawn as she always did. The silence of the house pressed in around her like fog. It was the kind of silence that made clocks tick louder and the creak of old floorboards feel like thunder. She stood in her kitchen, her fingers curled around a chipped ceramic mug, watching the world turn pale through frosted windows. The coffee in her cup had gone cold, untouched. Her mind was still in Kennel number 12. She couldn't stop thinking about Finn. There had been something behind those cloudy eyes, a flicker brief and uncertain, but enough. Enough to haunt her, enough to call her back. She placed the mug in the sink and opened the pantry. Her fingers hesitated over a can of soup, then moved toward an old tin tucked at the back dog treats. She hadn't opened it in years, not since Sonny. The lid creaked as she lifted it. The smell was faint now, stale but still familiar. She poured some into a paper bag and packed them into her coat pocket. Outside, the snow crunched beneath her boots. The roads hadn't been plowed yet, but her car started on the second try. As she drove, Maggie's thoughts wandered backward. At home that morning, she had been leafing through Harold's old journal. The leather cover was worn, its edges softened by time. She hadn't touched it in months. But something had led her to his shelf, to the place he'd always kept at top, right under the portrait of Sonny. Sonny had been their first golden retriever, a gift from Harold the year they moved into the house. He had been full of mischief, tail always wagging, always underfoot. He'd lived a good life, gone peacefully in Harold's arms just months before Harold himself passed. Maggie had sworn she wouldn't get another dog. The ache was too much. But this ache, this silence in her life was a different kind of wound. And Finn, that dog with old bones and quiet eyes, had opened it again. By the time she arrived at the shelter, the snow had begun to fall again, light and dry. The wind carried it like whispers across the parking lot. Maggie stepped inside, stamping snow off her boots. The front desk was manned by someone new today. A young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with thick brown hair pulled into a bun, glasses slipping down her nose, and a smile that was polite but cautious. Her name tag read, Jessie. She looked up from a clipboard as Maggie approached. "Good morning," Jessie said. "Are you here to adopt?" "No," Maggie said, then hesitated. "Not yet. I brought something." She pulled the paper bag from her coat. "For Finn." Jessie's brows lifted slightly. "Oh, he's still in the back. Not many folks ask for him." "I know," Maggie said quietly. Jessie led her through the rows of kennels. The dogs barked as they passed, some with excitement, some with stress. Maggie didn't flinch. She'd walked hospital corridors with screaming patients. She knew how to move through noise and keep her focus. When they reached Kennel 12, the barking faded. Finn lay in the same position, curled tightly, eyes half-lidded. The quilt Maggie had left was beneath him now, though rumpled and slightly wet from drool or melted snow tracked in on his fur. Maggie knelt again. She pulled the bag of treats from her pocket and shook it gently. "Hey, old boy," she murmured. "Remember me?" No response. She opened the bag and held one treat between her fingers, slipping it through the bars. It landed with a soft tap near his paw. Finn didn't move. Jessie stepped back, giving them space. "He didn't eat much this morning," she said, tone apologetic. "Sometimes we have to hand-feed him to get anything down." Maggie nodded but said nothing. She placed another treat, then another. Still no movement. Finally, with a sigh, she started to rise. And that's when it happened. Finn shifted. Barely. His head lifted an inch, then another. His eyes blinked slowly, and his gaze, still murky, still tired, found hers. Maggie's breath caught. The room seemed to still around her. For a heartbeat, it was just them. Finn's nostrils twitched. He sniffed the air faintly. Then inch by trembling inch, he leaned forward, his nose brushing against the treat. He didn't eat it, not yet, but he acknowledged it. "And her." Jessie's voice softened behind her. "That's the most he's moved all day." Maggie didn't answer. She reached slowly through the bars and rested her hand near the treat, palm up open. "I'm not in a rush," she whispered. "I'll wait." For several minutes they stayed like that. Snow swirled outside the windows. Dogs barked distantly. Time moved gently. Eventually Finn lay back down, but this time he rested his head facing her. It was enough. Maggie stood brushing off her knees. Jessie met her at the door. "You know," the young woman said, "we almost named him Shadow when he came in. He's so quiet, always slipping into corners." But Finn stuck. Someone here liked the idea of him having a real name again. "A real name," Maggie repeated. Outside, the wind had picked up. Maggie pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Do you think anyone will take him?" Jessie asked. Maggie didn't answer right away. She looked out across the parking lot, the snow now thick enough to hide her tire tracks. "I don't know," she said, "but he looked at me today. That counts for something." She turned and walked toward her car, the bag of treats now empty. Behind her, Kennel 12 remained quiet, but inside, an old dog with golden fur and tired eyes had shifted just enough to watch her leave. Snow was still falling when Maggie Clark pulled into the shelter parking lot 2 days later. The sky hung low, thick with a quiet kind of gray, and the air bit through her coat like needles. She tightened the scarf around her neck and stepped out of the car with purpose. The wind tugged at the edges of her parka, but she didn't slow. Something in her heart had already decided. She hadn't slept much the night before. She'd kept replaying the moment Finn had looked at her, that slow, uncertain recognition that had passed between them like a fragile thread. It was enough. It had to be. Inside the shelter, the usual cacophony of barking dogs greeted her. Jessie, the young woman she had met earlier, looked up from her desk and blinked in surprise. "Miss Maggie?" she asked. Back again, Maggie gave a small nod. "Yes, I'm here for him." Jessie stood, setting aside her clipboard. "For Finn?" "That's right." Maggie's voice was steady, though a flicker of fear curled beneath her ribs. "I want to bring him home." Jessie hesitated. You understand how old he is, right? He might not have long. Some days he can barely walk." Maggie's hands were clasped in front of her fingers, white at the knuckles. "Then he won't die alone." At that moment, Greg Holloway stepped out from a back room. He was the shelter manager, a man in his 50s, with a broad build, a full beard graying at the chin, and a voice that always seemed gentle despite its gravelly undertone. Greg had a reputation in town as someone who rarely spoke more than necessary, but always listened completely. "You're taking Finn?" he asked, his eyes narrowing, not in suspicion but concern. Maggie nodded. "I'm sure." Greg studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Let me get the paperwork." As Jessie retrieved Finn from the back, Maggie waited by the counter. Her hands trembled slightly, but her jaw was set. She thought of Sonny. She thought of Harold. And she thought of the way the silence in her home had started to press in like walls. Jessie returned with Finn walking slowly at his side. The dog's gait was unsteady, his back legs wobbled, and his movements were sluggish. But when his cloudy eyes met Maggie's, something flickered. Familiarity. Trust. Or maybe just the beginning of it. Maggie knelt and placed her hand on his side. "We're going home, old boy." The adoption process was swift. There wasn't much to it for a dog like Finn. No competition, no questions, just a signature, a printed receipt, and a whispered thank you from Jessie that lingered longer than most goodbyes. Greg carried Finn to the car for her. As he laid the old dog gently on a thick folded blanket in the back seat, he looked at Maggie again. "He may not make it through the winter," he said, voice low. "We've had dogs older than him, but not many, and none quite as worn." Maggie nodded. "But he'll be warm, and he'll be loved." Greg didn't reply. He just closed the car door with a soft finality. The drive home was quiet. Finn lay still, his body curled as if out of habit rather than comfort. Maggie glanced at him in the rearview mirror every few minutes, heart skipping at each twitch of movement. The snow danced around the car as she drove whispering across the windshield. Back at the house, Maggie pulled into the driveway. The cottage-style home sat nestled beneath two old maple trees, their bare branches stretched out like arms frozen mid-embrace. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the soft golden light of lamps glowed through the frosted windows. Inside, the fire crackled gently in the hearth. Maggie opened the back door and reached for Finn. He didn't move at first. His eyes opened unfocused, then blinked slowly. "Let's get you inside," she murmured. Lifting him was harder than she expected. His weight, though reduced from age and sickness, still bore down on her shoulders and knees, but she managed. Slowly, carefully, she carried him through the front door and into the warmth. The house smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon from the potpourri bowl she refreshed every few days. Maggie placed Finn down on a thick memory foam dog bed she had stored since Sonny passed. She'd unboxed it that morning, brushing off dust and laying it by the fireplace just where Sonny used to lie. Finn's eyes scanned the room, then fell shut. He let out a deep, rattling breath. Maggie knelt beside him, adjusting the blanket over his back. "You're home, Finn," she whispered. "This time, it's your turn to be cared for." The clock ticked quietly behind her. Outside, snow continued to fall, muffling the world. Later that evening, the phone rang. Maggie recognized the number before she picked up. It was Derek. Her son had his father's voice, though years of distance had drawn it tighter, more formal. They spoke once a week, usually on Sundays. This call was early. "Hi, Mom," Derek said. "Just checking in. Weather's nasty here. You doing okay?" Maggie sat down on the edge of the couch. "I'm fine. Bit of snow, nothing serious." There was a pause on the line, then Derek spoke again. "I might be late for Christmas. We're slammed at work, and Janet's not sure about travel with the kids." Maggie's lips pressed into a line. "I understand. You sure you're okay on your own?" Maggie looked over at Finn, who was now snoring gently, legs twitching in his sleep. "I'm not alone," she said softly. "What?" "Nothing." She lied. "Just talking to myself. You take care." They ended the call after a few more minutes of polite updates. She didn't mention Finn, didn't mention the warmth blooming slowly back into the corners of the house. She watched the fire for a long while after that, sipping tea and listening to the sound of Finn breathing. The silence felt different now, not hollow, but full. The wind howled low through the eaves of Maggie Clark's house as the deep winter night settled in. Outside the town of Willow Creek lay blanketed beneath several feet of snow. The roads quiet and windows glowing soft amber behind drawn curtains. Maggie had dozed off in her armchair, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, the fire still glowing behind the iron grate. The only sound in the room was the quiet hiss of burning logs and the occasional pop of ember. Finn was asleep too, or so she'd thought. He lay curled on the bed Maggie had laid near the fireplace, his breathing deep and slow. But sometime past midnight, a sound not loud but distinct stirred her from slumber. It wasn't the wind. Maggie opened her eyes, blinking against the dim light. At first she didn't see him. Then she did. Finn was no longer on his bed. He stood still in the middle of the living room, his head lifted slightly, body rigid in that uncertain posture that old dogs sometimes held somewhere between attention and memory. His cloudy eyes were fixed on something. Maggie followed his gaze. There above the mantel hung the photograph. A black and white frame of Harold Clark, tall, lean, with silver at his temples and a grin that curved more to one side than the other. He had been a quiet man with rough hands and a voice that dropped low when he was telling the truth. Finn didn't move. He just stared. And then as Maggie rose quietly to her feet and stepped toward him, she heard it. A whimper. so soft it was almost not there. A sound of something breaking from the inside. Maggie's breath hitched. She'd never heard Finn make a sound until now. She moved slowly toward him, the old floor creaking beneath her bare feet. Her fingers reached out hesitant, hovering just above his back. His fur, though still brittle and dry in places, gave a faint warmth beneath her touch. "It's okay," she whispered. Finn didn't flinch. In fact, he did something that stunned her. He leaned just slightly into her hand, his head turned ever so gently pressing into her palm. It was the first time. Maggie stood beside him in silence for a long moment, hand resting gently on his neck, the old photograph of Harold watching over them both. And in that moment, the house that had felt like a museum to memory began to feel once more like a place where life could move again. The next morning, the sun broke through the frost-laced windows with surprising clarity. Maggie brewed a pot of tea and on a whim pulled out her old stationery. The ivory paper still smelled faintly of cedar and dust. She hadn't written a letter by hand in years. She sat at the dining table, pen in hand, and began to write. "Dear Derek, I know you've been busy and life has moved forward in its own ways for all of us, but I thought I'd share something different today. A story, I guess. Or maybe just a small piece of something you've missed while chasing the noise of the world. I adopted a dog. Yes, me. His name is Finn. He's old 17, they think, and came from a shelter where no one wanted him. He reminds me of Sonny in the way he sleeps, and of your father in the way he watches the room in silence. He's quiet, gentle, and he looked at me last night like he knew who that man in the photograph was. I've attached a picture. He was lying in the sunlight this morning. I think you'll see what I mean. Love, Mom." Maggie clipped a Polaroid to the letter. She'd snapped it just an hour before Finn, lying in the morning light by the fireplace, his body relaxed, his nose slightly buried in the edge of his blanket. She tucked the letter into an envelope, sealed it with a small floral sticker, and placed it by the door for the next time she went into town. That afternoon, the wind died down. The world grew quieter still. Maggie worked slowly around the house, cleaning out the guest room just in case Derek changed his mind and came for Christmas. Finn followed her barely. His legs didn't carry him far, but every time she left the room a few minutes later, he'd appear in the doorway, pausing as if to say, "I'm still here." And each time Maggie smiled. Later, just before dinner, Maggie stepped out onto the porch to shake out a rug. She stood a while watching the light fall against the snowbanks like spilled gold. The air was sharp and clean. She heard the faint creak of the floorboards behind her. She turned. Finn was standing just inside the doorway, wobbly, slow but standing. His tail flicked once. A twitch, a whisper, but unmistakable. Maggie's hand flew to her mouth. Her throat tightened. "Good boy," she whispered. She crouched and opened her arms slightly, not expecting much, but Finn took one careful step forward, then another, until his nose rested against her coat and he sighed a soft, raspy sound, but full of something she hadn't heard from him before. Relief, or maybe contentment. Maggie wrapped her arms gently around his shoulders, letting him rest against her. The sun dipped behind the trees. The fire flickered inside. And somewhere deep inside her chest, Maggie felt something flicker too. Something warm. Something alive. The frost clung to the windows in delicate lace patterns, the kind Maggie Clark used to trace with her finger when she was a girl. Days had passed since Finn's tail first moved, and while progress came slowly, it came. Each morning brought a sliver more life into the house. Finn now rose to greet her with a single step. He followed her into the kitchen sometimes. He'd even started eating a little if the food was warmed and soaked in broth. Maggie no longer counted minutes in silence, but in breaths and tail flicks and the click of paws against hardwood. This morning, as sunlight spilled golden through the eastern window, Finn lay with his nose resting on his front paws. Maggie sat nearby with her sewing basket. She had decided to wash Finn's collar, the one he'd worn when she adopted him. It was stiff with age, a faded navy blue fabric with frayed edges and worn threading. As she unstitched one of the inner folds to reinforce it, her needle caught something unexpected, a glint of brass. Curious. Maggie laid the collar flat and pulled carefully at the stitching. A small metal tag, no bigger than a thumbnail, was sewn into the lining. It was tarnished edges, worn smooth. But as she turned it in the light, she saw the words, "Therapy Unit, Vets Hospital, number 2049. Her breath caught. She had known Finn had come from a veterans facility, but this was the first tangible proof, a thread to his past, a chapter she might still recover. She reached for her notebook, one she used for grocery lists and handwritten recipes, and scribbled the number and name down. After a moment's hesitation, she picked up the landline. The automated operator directed her through several menus. Finally, a soft male voice answered. "This is Lawson speaking, Veterans Therapy Division." "Hello," Maggie said, adjusting her glasses. "My name is Margaret Clark. I think I adopted one of your former dogs." There was a pause. "Former therapy dogs." "Yes, a golden retriever. His collar had your hospital's tag. Unit 2049. Lawson's voice changed softer, more alert. "Golden 17 or so." That would have to be Finn. A silence bloomed between them. "We thought he was gone," Lawson continued. "He was retired over a year ago. I wasn't working here yet, but I've heard about him. He was one of the long runners." "What do you mean?" Maggie asked gently. "He was trained for emotional stabilization," Lawson explained. "Worked primarily with veterans struggling with PTSD, anxiety, and grief. He had this stillness to him. You know what I mean? Maggie did. Do you know where he served, who handled him?" "There should be files," Lawson said, tapping at a keyboard. "Some of it's archived hard copies. I can't promise much, but if I find anything, I'll call you back." "What's your number?" She gave it, thanked him, and hung up, heart thudding not from excitement but from the strange mix of relief and apprehension. That evening, she took out her letterbox, the one with old envelopes she never sent. She flipped through them, some to Harold, others addressed but never mailed to Derek. Words she couldn't say when it mattered. She lit a fire, poured tea, and settled beside Finn. He was snoring lightly now, paws twitching. She reached for the most recent letter from Derek, the one that had arrived just yesterday. His handwriting was firm, slanted slightly to the right. "Mom, I got your letter. Sorry I took so long to reply. Work's been a mess. Janet's mother is staying with us, and it's a lot. But your letter about the dog. Finn. He looks like Dad in that photo. The way he lays there like he's guarding something. I didn't expect that to hit me so hard. I miss him. I miss you too. I guess I just didn't know how to come back after he died. Tell me more about Finn." Maggie blinked hard, wiping beneath her glasses. She looked at the dog, then reached for a fresh page. "Derek. You were right. He does guard something. I think he guards silence. And maybe sorrow too, but he also guards the light in the room when it returns. Today he walked to the kitchen without me calling. He licked my wrist when I knelt. These are small things, but they feel like miracles. The hospital he came from is calling me back. I want to know more. I think Finn had a life before the forgetting started. I hope you come home soon." She didn't seal the letter. Not yet. She set it beside the fireplace and watched Finn dream. And far away in a drawer full of dusty records, the story of a younger Finn, perhaps not even called Finn, waited quietly to be remembered. The snow had begun to melt in slow trickles along the edges of Willow Creek's streets, leaving behind patches of brown grass and glistening puddles on the sidewalks. A hint of thaw hung in the air, though the mountains still wore their white crowns. Maggie Clark stood on her porch, gloved hands tucked into her coat pockets, watching as Finn slowly stepped down the wooden stairs, his movements shaky but determined. His joints were stiff, but he was walking, on his own. Today they were going somewhere new. Maggie had received a call the night before from Lawson, the young man at the Veterans Hospital. His voice had been eager, almost relieved. "I found someone," he said. "A man named Thomas Grady. He's a retired Army medic. Used to be a patient here. He's the one who worked with Finn the longest. He asked if he could meet him if that's something you'd be open to." Maggie didn't hesitate. "Of course," she said. And so now they were on their way. The hospital was 40 minutes from Willow Creek, tucked into the edge of a pine forest where old brick buildings gave way to sprawling green grounds, though they were gray and patchy this time of year. Maggie drove carefully, casting glances in the rearview mirror. Finn lay curled in the back seat, head resting on a folded quilt. He didn't sleep, but he didn't seem anxious either. His eyes were open, watching the landscape pass as if trying to remember something. The VA hospital lobby was warmer than she expected. Soft lighting, worn but clean furniture, and the smell of antiseptic mingled with coffee. The receptionist, a round-faced woman in her 50s named Denise, greeted her with a curious smile when Maggie introduced herself. "Room 214, Denise said after checking a note. Mr. Grady's expecting you. Second floor, West Wing. Finn walked beside her, slower than usual, but with more alertness than she'd seen in weeks. His nose twitched at the sense, ears flicking at distant sounds, voices beeping, machines, footsteps. It was as if the building itself had stirred something old and buried inside him. At the door to room 214, Maggie knocked once, then pushed it open. Thomas Grady sat by the window, sunlight casting a glow on his deeply lined face. He looked to be in his late 70s, with a frame that had once been solid but now sat hunched and narrow in a padded chair. His skin was pale, his beard close-cropped and silver, and a faded U.S. Army tattoo peeked from under the cuff of his sleeve. He turned slowly, then froze. His eyes widened. Finn Maggie barely had time to react before Finn took a halting step forward. Then another. Then suddenly his tail gave a single slow wag. Thomas let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "Oh my God," he whispered. "It's you." He reached out with both hands, trembling slightly. Finn pressed his muzzle into the man's palms. Maggie stepped back, heart tightening in her chest. She had seen Finn come alive more each day, but nothing like this. Here now in this room, he looked almost young again. Thomas buried his face in the scruff of Finn's neck, his shoulders shaking. "I thought they'd put you down," he choked. "When they said the program ended, I thought I'd never see you again." Maggie blinked hard. Thomas looked up at her. "You're the one who took him." She nodded. "Yes. About a month ago. From the Willow Creek shelter. I owe you more than I can say," he murmured, brushing a hand down Finn's back. "This dog saved my life. More than once." He gestured to the chair across from him. Maggie sat folding her hands in her lap. Thomas took a deep breath. "I was in a dark place when they assigned him to me. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, I wouldn't speak to anyone. They brought Finn in, told me he was calm, didn't push, just stayed. And that's exactly what he did. Every day he just sat beside me. And one day, I talked. I don't even remember what I said. But I talked. And he listened." Finn laid down at Thomas's feet, now content. Maggie watched the two of them in silence for several moments. The warmth in her chest was different now, less like fire and more like sunlight. After an hour, Maggie gently rose. "We should get going. He tires easily." Thomas nodded, though his eyes lingered on Finn. "Thank you. For bringing him. For not giving up on him." Maggie smiled. "I didn't save him. He's the one doing the saving." As they walked back to the car, Finn looked back once, his ears twitching. He didn't whimper or bark, just looked. And that was enough. That evening, as Maggie made tea, the phone rang. She answered, expecting a robocall, but it was Derek. "Mom," he said. His voice was quiet, almost tentative. "I got your last letter, and the picture of Finn." She leaned against the counter, her hand curled around the phone cord. "I called because I wanted to say I'm proud of you." Maggie blinked. "Proud of me for taking him in, for giving him something I haven't been brave enough to give anyone in a long time." There was a pause. "I booked a flight," he added. "I'll be home for Christmas. I want to meet him." Maggie closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the moment sink in. "Then he'll be waiting." She looked over at Finn, who lay curled by the fire, eyes half-lidded. His body still ached, his steps were slow, but his spirit was still mending others. The sky over Willow Creek had turned a pale milk-glass gray, the kind of sky that didn't roar with storms but whispered them in. Snow had been falling gently all day, fine powdery flakes that gathered in silence along rooftops and fence posts. Inside the Clark home, the fireplace crackled in a steady rhythm, casting orange shadows along the wooden floor. Finn lay curled by the hearth, his breathing labored. It had started the night before he refused food for the first time in days, turned his head away from the warm broth Maggie had coaxed him with. His chest had risen and fallen in uneven waves, and there was a rasp to it, low and troubling. At first, Maggie had thought maybe it was just fatigue from the trip to the VA hospital. But by morning, she knew it was something more. Maggie stood over him now, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her phone and dialed the local vet clinic. Dr. Carla Whitmore answered on the second ring. Carla was in her early 40s with short-cropped auburn hair, a wide, serious mouth, and kind but unsentimental eyes. She had grown up in Willow Creek, inherited the clinic from her father, and ran it with quiet precision. "Bring him in now," Carla said after Maggie described the symptoms. "I'll wait. Don't worry about appointments." The wind picked up as Maggie loaded Finn into the back seat of her Subaru. She wrapped him in a blanket, one stitched with blue stars, the one he always seemed to prefer. He didn't struggle. His eyes fluttered but didn't quite close. She spoke to him the whole way there. Not full sentences, just gentle reassurances like singing a lullaby without melody. At the clinic, Carla met her at the door. She wore navy scrubs and a thick down vest, her stethoscope already slung around her neck. One of the vet techs, a young man named Luis with a calm voice and sleeves of black ink up both arms, helped carry Finn into the exam room. The space smelled of antiseptic and cedar shavings, the usual blend of comfort and sterility. Maggie sat in the corner as Carla listened to Finn's heart. The room was silent save for the clicking of monitors and the subtle wheeze of Finn's breath. Carla's brow furrowed. "His lungs are struggling," she said softly. "Age is catching up all at once. Could be pneumonia, could be heart failure, it's hard to say without tests. But at his age, we have to be realistic about intervention." Maggie nodded, her face pale but her voice calm. "Can I stay with him?" "Of course." Carla reached out, squeezed her hand. "We'll get him on oxygen, some fluids. But Maggie, you should prepare yourself." She nodded again, lips tight. They moved Finn to a quiet recovery room, warmer and dimmer than the others. Maggie sat on the floor beside the low cot, her knees stiff, her hands folded on the blanket that covered him. His breathing came in faint, wheezing bursts. His eyes were half closed. Maggie took his paw gently into her hand. It was cool. She rubbed it slowly, whispering his name. "You've done enough, my sweet boy," she murmured. "You don't have to fight if it's too hard. I'll understand." She leaned close, pressing her forehead to the top of his head. "If you need to rest, rest." And then quietly Finn stirred. His eyelids lifted just barely, and a faint flick of recognition returned. His tongue, dry and slow, pressed against the back of her hand. One gentle lick. Maggie let out a breath that collapsed into a sob. It wasn't much, but it was something. A thread held in trembling teeth. They stayed like that for an hour, maybe more. The snow outside had thickened, turning the windows into fogged panes of white. Later that night, as Maggie prepared to leave the clinic to let Finn rest under observation, a car pulled into her driveway back home. Headlights swept across the porch. She looked up from the teacup she'd forgotten to drink and stepped to the front window. Derek. He stepped out of the car in a dark wool coat scarf tucked into the collar. His hair was damp from the snowfall, his face drawn older than it should have been. He looked up at the house and then, with slow steps, approached the front door. Maggie met him there. "Where is he?" Derek asked, voice raw. "At the clinic," she replied. "They're doing what they can." He stepped inside, shaking snow from his sleeves. Then, as if drawn by memory or gravity, he looked down at the bed near the fireplace. "Does he still lie here?" he asked. "He does," she said. "I was afraid he wouldn't remember me." Maggie blinked. "He remembers everything that matters." But before they could say more, the phone rang. It was Carla. "He's stable," she said. "The oxygen helped. His heart's still weak, but he's breathing easier. He's looking around." "I'll come get him," Maggie said without hesitation. She and Derek returned to the clinic together. This time Derek carried Finn in his arms slowly, carefully, as if carrying something sacred. The dog's weight sagged against him, but his eyes were alert. His head nestled against Derek's shoulder. When they stepped through the front door of the house, the snow outside falling like feathers, Finn stirred. He pushed gently out of Derek's arms. His paws touched the floor, shaky, unsure. But then one step, then another, toward the fire, toward the familiar place. And then just before settling down, he turned, saw Derek. And with more effort than seemed possible for a body so frail, Finn's tail wagged. Once, twice. Derek sank to his knees, eyes wet, hand pressed to Finn's neck. "Hi, old boy," he whispered. "You waited for me." Maggie watched from the doorway, tears rolling freely now, and outside the snow fell soft, not cold, not cruel, but quiet and forgiving, like the sky itself was holding its breath for this moment of grace. The world had shifted in the quietest of ways. It had been nearly a month since that storm-swept night when Derek had come home and Finn, against all odds, had risen to greet him. The snows of Willow Creek had begun to recede now, revealing the dull, waiting earth beneath. Trees stood bare still, but the sun was climbing earlier, lingering longer. Something inside the house had changed too, not with grand declarations or dramatic turns, just in the way it breathed fuller, deeper. That morning, the first day of the new year, the Clark porch was blanketed in a thin film of frost. The air was sharp but kind, the kind of cold that asked you to step into it rather than brace against it. Maggie sat in her wooden rocker, an old wool blanket across her lap. Her hands curled around a chipped ceramic mug, Harold's favorite, still bearing the faint outline of his initials. Finn lay beside her, wrapped in his own blanket head, resting on Maggie's foot. He was still thin. His bones still jutted in places, and his steps remained careful. But his eyes were clearer now, his breathing steady. There was something settled in him, something content. Every so often his tail thumped against the porch floor with a soft, lazy rhythm. Derek joined them with a steaming mug in hand, his breath fogging in the morning air. He wore a gray sweater, his dark hair tousled from sleep. His expression was softer these days, shoulders less guarded, eyes more reflective. He took the seat beside Maggie and exhaled deeply. Neither of them spoke at first. They just watched as the horizon shifted from indigo to gold, a pale line of orange spilling across the hills like ink on parchment. The birds hadn't begun their morning songs yet, but the world felt like it was holding its breath in the beauty of the moment. Finn stirred. He shifted closer to Maggie, rested his chin in her lap, and sighed. Derek smiled, reaching down to stroke the dog's head. "I still can't believe he made it," he murmured. Maggie nodded slowly. "Neither can I. But I think he had one more winter in him, one more morning like this." There was silence again, but not the kind that hurt. It was full of memory and warmth, a silence that understood. Maggie looked out toward the horizon and then at her son. "Your father used to say something to me back when things got hard." Derek turned his eyes to her, curious. He said, "Love doesn't live in years, it lives in the seconds you give away. The seconds you dare to give even when you don't know if they'll be remembered." She smiled, running her fingers gently through Finn's fur. "It's not about how long, it's about how full." Derek was quiet for a moment. Then he whispered, "I miss him." "I know," Maggie said, her voice steady. "So do I. But I see him in you. More every day." They sat like that until the sun fully crested the hills. Finn shifted again, lifting his head, eyes blinking against the golden light. Then slowly, he leaned into Maggie's side. She chuckled softly and rubbed behind his ears. Derek set his mug down and leaned back in the chair. "I've made a decision," he said suddenly. Maggie raised an eyebrow. "I'm taking a leave from work. Janet and I are talking about moving here, near town. Maybe renting for a while. The kids could come up on weekends." Maggie blinked, caught off guard. "You'd really do that?" He nodded. "I've spent a long time running towards something I couldn't name, but this place, you and this old dog, you reminded me that coming home isn't about where you go, it's about who you become when you stop running." Finn gave a small thump of his tail as if agreeing. Maggie reached out, took Derek's hand in hers. "He brought you back," she said. "That's more than I could have asked for." "No," Derek said quietly. "You both did." A breeze stirred through the pines, rattling the last of the dead needles still clinging to the branches. Finn closed his eyes, nose twitching. Maggie kissed the top of his head. "We'll make every day count," she whispered. And there on that porch in the soft dawn of a new year, with the old dog between them and the weight of loss no longer unbearable, the Clarks sat in the light, not in mourning, not in fear, but in peace. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or lightning. They come quietly on four tired legs with cloudy eyes and a heart that still chooses to love. Finn was never meant to be forgotten. He was meant to be found. And in his healing, a family found their way home again. This story is not just about a dog or a woman or a son. It's about how love, even in its final hour, can still restore what was lost. It's about how God often sends us healing not in the form we expect, but in the form we need. A loyal companion, a second chance, a sunrise shared in silence. In a world that moves fast, let this story remind us to slow down and see the quiet blessings around us. Maybe it's in the wag of a tired tail, the warmth of a fire on a cold morning, or the voice of someone who still believes in coming home. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope never grows old. Comment below and tell us, have you ever experienced a moment that felt like a quiet miracle? And if you're watching this with your pet nearby, give them a little hug for us. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that God is still working in the smallest, softest ways. May the Lord bless you, guide you, and send you the love you need, even in unexpected forms. If this story moved your spirit, comment below. Amen.